Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great privilege to welcome back again the Revd Dr John Polkinghorne, who has had a very distinguished career in the whole field of science and religion. Was previously Professor of Mathematical Physics in Cambridge, later on became ordained, became a priest in the Church of England, was also the President of Queen's College, Cambridge, just down the road, and has written a huge number of books which have been translated into 16 different languages, I think we were hearing yesterday, and have been hugely influential all over the world in the whole field of science and religion. So we're delighted to welcome John back, and he's going to speak to us this afternoon on the question, can a scientist pray? Thank you very much, John.
Well, thanks very much. Well, can a scientist pray? Well, how you answer that question will depend a bit on what sort of prayer you have in mind. After all, there are lots of different ways of praying. There's praise and thanksgiving, there's penitence, there's petition, and so on and so on. And I actually think that quite a lot of scientists pray without actually knowing that they're praying. Because we were thinking yesterday about the experience of wonder that comes to scientists as the marvellous order of the world and its fruitful history is revealed to our inquiry. And I think that sense of wonder, whether scientists know it or not, that sense of wonder is actually an act of worship of the Creator whose will and purpose lies behind the world. But of course the most probing aspect of asking the question, can a scientist pray, is in relation to petitionary prayer. I mean, can we really believe that God actually acts in the world in the course of history? God might hold the world in being, endow it with its remarkable character, but does God actually do particular things on particular occasions? Well, those of us who live in faith traditions that speak in personal terms of God do believe that that is so. We call God Father rather than Force, not because we think God's old man with a beard above the sky, but because we do believe that God does do particular things, particular occasions, not unrelentingly the same in the way that, say, the force of gravity would be. I think there's no doubt that in many people's minds the advance of science has diminished the expectation or the credibility of believing in God's providential action in the course of history. The Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England was produced in 1662, and that book includes a prayer asking for God's blessing on the crops by the provision of seasonable weather. Our current contemporary worship book, which is called Common Worship, contains no such prayer. The nearest you can get to it is a retrospective harvest collect, being thankful for the fruits of the earth after they have been garnered in. The why you should be thankful afterwards, what you didn't have the nerve to ask for beforehand, is not entirely clear. So has science, and science's account of the causal structure of the world, has it disposed of the possibility of believing that God acts in the world? I mean, doesn't the weather just happen? Well, if science had told us, as science did seem to tell us in the 18th and 19th centuries, that its picture of the world was a picture of a mechanical world, a sort of clockwork world, in which things just ticked away, inexorably developed in the way that they had to develop, then I suppose the best you could expect for God would be simply the role of the cosmic clockmaker, the chap who started it all off, wound it up. Then you'd have to hope that God had done that sufficiently cleverly, things not to work out too badly, at least most of the time. But 20th century physics saw the death of a merely mechanical view of the world. Whatever the physical world is, it is something more subtle, and I'm going to argue more subtle than simply a piece of gigantic cosmic clockwork. And that death of mechanism, the fact that the world is not simply tame, controllable, predictable in that sort of quasi-Newtonian way, that came about through the discovery of two aspects of our scientific understanding of the causal structure of the world that emerged very clearly in the course of the 20th century. The first was the existence of intrinsic unpredictabilities present in physical process. The first wave of that discovery, as of course we all know, was the quantum unpredictability of the subatomic world. And it was a considerable surprise when in about the middle of the 20th century people realized that even the world of everyday experience, the world seemingly so well described by classical Newtonian physics was also a world that had a good deal of intrinsic unpredictability present in it. There were clocks in that world. There were regular things whose behavior could be known beforehand, but there were also many clouds. And this was the discovery, of course, of chaos theory. There are many systems of such extraordinary sensitivity that the slightest disturbance in their environment totally changes their future behavior. A very surprising discovery. I'm sure you all know about it, the so-called butterfly effect. That, in fact, the Earth's weather system can be in such a sensitive state that it is a sort of serious scientific joke. The best jokes are serious jokes. A serious scientific joke to say that a butterfly stirring the air with its wings in the African jungle today might create a disturbance which grew and grew and grew exponentially, so that in about 3 or 4 weeks' time it would create a storm over East Anglia. We can say with confidence that detailed long-term weather forecasting is never going to work. We shall never know about all those African butterflies. And the important thing about these unpredictabilities, the quantum unpredictabilities and the chaotic unpredictabilities, is that they are intrinsic. We're not talking about a situation where if we measured things a bit more precisely, calculated things a bit more exactly, we could produce a better prediction of what's going to happen. These are intrinsic aspects of the world. And what we make of that, I'll come on to in a minute. But that is so, is something that the 20th century has revealed to us, and it certainly shows us that whatever the world is, it's not mere mechanism. The other thing I want to say about science's account of causal structure of the world, and our understanding of how it works, is that it is patchy. We understand bits of the physical world quite well. We understand quite a lot about the subatomic quantum world. We understand quite a lot about chaotic systems in the everyday world. But we don't know how to put those two sets of insights, how to put them together in a consistent way. We are unable to combine quantum theory and chaos theory in a single overarching theory of the structure of the world. They just don't fit together. The reason that is very simple. Quantum theory has a scale. It has a notion of bigness, which is set by Planck's constant. If your system has a property called action, which is large compared to Planck's constant, then that's an absolute description of large size. But we all know, of course, that the chaos theory is characterized by fractal behavior. And fractals are things that have no intrinsic scale. They are the same all the way down. Think about the Mandelbrot set. It's a collection of whorls and dragon claws, which are made out of whorls and dragon claws all the way down. And you clearly can't put together in a consistent way a theory that has a scale, quantum theory, with a theory that doesn't have a scale, fractal chaos. And it's important to recognize that. Okay, so the world's unpredictable. It's also, our understanding of it is patchy. We can't put it all together properly. What are we to make of all that? In particular, what's the significance of unpredictability? Now, unpredictability is what the learned call an epistemological property. It's concerned with our knowledge, what we can know or what we cannot know. And unpredictability tells us we cannot know about the future behavior of these systems. Now, what you can know, what is actually the case, epistemology on the one hand, and ontology on the other hand, what is the actual nature of things, there is no inevitable connection between those two. It is a matter for metaphysical decision, what connection you believe to exist between what we can know and what is actually the case. It's one of the central questions of philosophy about what would be the right view to take about that, the most productive view to take about that, and perhaps it is the central question of the philosophy of science, so what connection to make between epistemology and ontology. The great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, I suppose the sort of father of modern philosophy in a way, disconnected the two very, very, very severely. Kant believed that we could observe the appearance of things, phenomena as he called them. They loomed out of a sort of chaotic fog, but we couldn't know things in themselves. We couldn't know noumena. We couldn't know the actual nature of things. What appeared to us, what was actually the case. In Kant's thinking, were quite disjoint. Now, of course, scientists don't take that point of view. I don't think many of us would do science that we didn't think that what we were learning about was what the world is actually like. I mean, that's the sort of prime motivation for doing science. So scientists aren't Kantians in that sense, but they are realists. They believe that what we know, what is the case, are closely connected with each other. That's the realist position. My wife once gave me a sweatshirt which has inscribed upon it the beautiful words that she had often heard me speak on occasions like this: epistemology models ontology. You get some pretty funny looks if you walk down the street wearing a sweatshirt. I once stopped by somebody who said, "What does that mean?" And I said, it means that what we can know is a reliable guide to what is the case. And she said, "Sure, what else could it be?" But of course that's philosophers are able to question common sense understanding of things. Now, it's a metaphysical decision or a philosophical decision about what connection you make between what you know and what is the case. There is no inevitable, necessary entailment. And that incidentally implies immediately that though our scientific understandings of things certainly constrain what we think about the causal structure of the world, they do not determine it. Causality ultimately requires acts of metaphysical decision as well as taking into account what science can tell us about the connectivity of events taking place in the world. It's a bit like the science is in relation to causality. It's a bit like the foundations of a house in relation to the edifice that you erect upon it. The foundations, of course, constrain the house you can build, but they don't determine the detailed shape of what the house is going to be. Similarly, what science can tell us about causal connections between things doesn't determine in itself the nature of causality. And you can see that very clearly, actually, by thinking about quantum theory. Most people say quantum theory is probabilistic and indeterministic. The first statement is true. Quantum theory is intrinsically probabilistic. We all know that if you have a radioactive atom, you can only give a certain probability for its decay in the next hour. But that probability or unpredictability might arise from two quite different sources. It might arise from ignorance of finer detail that actually determined what was going to happen. Each little nucleus might have a little clock on it saying that you decay at 12:15 today, but we are unable to read that clock. That would be probability arising simply from ignorance of the detail of what's going on. Or it might arise, of course, from an intrinsic indeterminacy. And it turns out that you can interpret quantum theory in either of those ways. The mainstream interpretation of quantum theory, which I am myself an adherent, interprets the quantum probabilities as reflecting the existence of an intrinsic indeterminacy in quantum mechanics. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle was, of course, originally discovered by Heisenberg as an epistemological principle. It was a question of what you could measure. You couldn't measure with simultaneously and with complete accuracy both the position of a quantum particle and its momentum. It was an epistemological statement. But almost all quantum theorists, immediately following Heisenberg and subsequently, have interpreted that epistemological restriction on measurement ontologically. They have seen Heisenberg's uncertainty principle as not being a principle of necessary ignorance, but a principle of actual indeterminacy. That is a move from epistemology to ontology. It's a perfectly respectable, defensible move to make, but it is not an inevitable move to make. And it was a considerable surprise in the 1950s when that very clever but somehow wayward physicist David Bohm came along and produced an interpretation of quantum theory which gives exactly the same experimental consequences as the conventional Copenhagen interpretation, but is a deterministic theory whose probabilities arise simply from the ignorance of inaccessible fine detail, the existence of hidden variables, as people say in the trade. It had been thought that John von Neumann had mathematically proved that you couldn't do that, but of course when Bohm went and did it, people had to re-examine von Neumann's proof, and it turned out that very clever, great mathematician had just assumed what he wanted to prove. in the way he'd set up the problem. So you have a choice. You can either go with Bohr and interpret quantum theory indeterministically, or you can go with Bohm and interpret it deterministically. As I say, most physicists, including me, will go with Bohr, but we do so not for physics reasons, since empirically we can't tell the difference between the two theories, but for metaphysical reasons. So I think all of us who think about these things will acknowledge that Bohm's theory is very clever, but many of us feel it's too clever by half. It's highly ingenious, but it also has the air of contrivance. You see, Bohm did his trick by separating wave and particle. As you know, in conventional quantum theory, wave and particle are complementary aspects of the same entity. But in Bohm's theory, there is both a wave and a particle. His particles are as unproblematically particulate as Isaac Newton himself could have wished them to be. The wave, however, is a hidden wave, and it encodes instantaneously, it encodes information about the whole environment. And it directs the motion of the particles, and it produces the typical quantum effects like interference effects by the way in which the wave influences the motion of the particle. It is a very ingenious and instructive theory. But of course, if Bohm's going to have a wave, he's got to have a wave equation. And what's the wave equation? Well, you won't be surprised to learn it's the Schrödinger equation. And where did Bohm get the Schrödinger equation from? He got it from Schrödinger. He knew he wouldn't get the right results unless he put by hand that equation into his theory. In conventional quantum theory, we can motivate the Schrödinger equation in a rather less direct way. And there are a number of other technical difficulties about Bohm's theory, but for most of us, that's the sort of consideration, meta-scientific, see, beyond science itself, consideration that makes us put our money on indeterminacy rather than upon Bohm's theory, which Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is, of course, simply a theory of necessary ignorance. Now, it seems to me that it is equally possible to interpret the unpredictability of chaos theory in a similar way. Where we don't have to think it's simply epistemological, it's simply about what we can work out, but we can believe that it represents the presence of an ontological openness in chaotic systems. Now, not many people, I've been quite a proponent of that view, without a vast number of followers, I have to say. And the people who have declined to follow have mostly said, well, the chaos is deterministic chaos. And look at the equations from which we derive chaos theory, they are deterministic equations. And of course, that's obviously right. But we also know that the equations are themselves not correct. They are the equations of Newtonian dynamics, and though Newtonian dynamics is a very good theory, it is not ultimately the true theory. We know that Newtonian mechanics is not adequate. And I think that means that we don't have to invoke deterministic chaos in that end of the argument way. But we can say, okay, this cloudiness represented by these chaotic systems is open to ontological interpretation as the presence of a degree of openness in macroscopic everyday processes, just like the way that pretty well all physicists interpret quantum indeterminacy, quantum unpredictability in that way. So I think we live in a world, physical world, whose nature is undoubtedly more supple than that mechanism, and can perfectly legitimately and with perfect intellectual propriety be interpreted as not being simply more subtle than we have thought it to be, but also more supple, a world open to its future. And that's the most important thing I'm going to say this afternoon, I think, probably. Okay, well, what do we mean by saying that the world is open to its future in that sort of way? I certainly don't want by that to say that I think the future is some sort of random lottery, and who knows what's going to happen, because it's all just a sort of cosmic roulette machine. To say that the future is open is not to say that there are not causal principles that bring about the future, but to say, in my view, that those causal principles are wider than those described by conventional physical science description of the world. Physical science has built its picture of causality in the world on essentially a picture of a reductionist, atomistic picture of the exchange of energy between constituents. That's the story that it tells. And of course it's a very persuasive and successful story in many respects. But what I'm arguing when I speak about the future being open is that that doesn't soak up all the room for causal maneuver that there might be in the world. There's a room also for other causal principles to be at work in the world. And I'm going to seek to exploit that possibility in what I have to say, in what follows. And if we begin to think what those other causal principles might be, we can, I think, begin to suspect that they might be complementary to the conventional scientific description. Scientific description is in terms of constituents and in terms of the exchange of energy. If we think about what causal room for maneuver might be left, say, in a chaotic system, first of all, it has to be considered holistically. Chaotic systems, because of their sensitivity to the environment, can never truly be separated from the environment. So instead of simply merely having a constituent picture, which of course is certainly part of the story, but instead of having merely a constituent picture, we will need to complement that by some holistic description which thinks about systems in their totalities rather than terms simply of bits and pieces. And if you think about the future options that are open to a chaotic system, they don't differ from each other by the energy that's present in the whole system, but they do differ from each other in the patterns in which the energy flows in the system. In other words, the extra room for maneuver there is not in terms of energy input pushing it in this direction or that. It's much more like the input of something that you might in some way describe as information. By information in this level, I mean something like the specification of dynamic patterns of energy flow. They are the open part of the future of chaotic systems, the way in which the energy actually flows in the system. So I think that we should go for a picture of the causal structure of the world that has both constituent energy exchanges and also holistic informational forms of causality operating in the world. One of the attractions of taking that point of view would be that it would, in a sort of, admittedly somewhat hand-waving way, but I think an attractive and persuasive way, it would accommodate something in which we have direct experience, and that is the experience of agency. I raise my arm. When I raise my arm, there is of course a bits and pieces description of what's going on, currents flowing in the nerve, muscles contract, all that sort of thing. But I raise my arm. That's an action of me as the whole person. That's what we mean by agency. If you give me a little electric shock and make my arm jump up, I say, you did that. And I choose myself to raise my arm. Then I am acting as a whole person. And I think that our description of the nature of the world and its causal structure, if it's going to be adequate to our experience, has to be able to accommodate our experiences, I think, irreduced from the direct experiences of human agency. Of course, I know that philosophers can argue about this, and if you like, we can argue about it in the discussion period. But I'm going to take our experiences of human agency as being a sort of basic fact about the world. And if we, in our limited but real ways, are able to exercise agency and play a role in bringing about the future, it would not be altogether surprising, it would, if the creator of that world was not also able to act in the unfolding history of the world, in its openness, so that the extra causal principles would not simply be human agency, but also include the possibility of God's providential agency. Exercise, I would suggest, by the input of pure information, pure shaping of the pattern of history into the unfolding structure of a world of true becoming. And that's the picture that of course it's a hand-waving picture. These problems of agency are too difficult, whether it's human agency or providential agency, are too difficult for us to solve in a completely convincing and worked out way. The American philosopher Thomas Nagel, talking about these problems, uses a phrase which I like very much. He says, he's talking about human agency, he says, the best that we can manage is pre-Socratic flailings around. Now, it's a wonderful phrase that you unpick it. What he's saying is this: the pre-Socratics, people like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, they had this wonderful idea that the world might, the great variety of the world, might be made out of a single sort of stuff, perceived and experienced in different sort of degrees of density or rarefaction in that sort of way. They had different views about what that stuff might be. Thales thought it was water, and so on and so on. But they had this wonderful idea that beneath the vast variety of the world, there might be a single sort of underlying substance out of which it was all made. They were, in fact, and I can't really say a greater tribute to this, they were in a sense the first elementary particle physicists. They were, of course, a little bit too early, 2.5 millennia too early, to get on to quarks and gluons, but they were looking in the right direction. They were waving their hands, flailing around, but they were waving in the right direction. And I think that in terms of human agency, and indeed what many religious believers would claim to be an experience of God's providential agency, that we are waving our hands too. But I think the sort of interpretation that I've been suggesting to you, this complementary openness of systems, is a wave in the right direction. And that feeling is somewhat reinforced by what I think is one of the most interesting developments taking place in contemporary science. And that is the theory, that is complexity theory. Science's great technique has been, of course, reductionism, methodologically reductionism, split things up into bits and pieces, and we do that basically because it's easier to think about bits and pieces than it is to think about complicated totalities. I'm a particle physicist, and you can't get more bits and pieces really than particle physics. And we've learned a vast number of interesting, important things in that sort of way. Divide and rule has been the motto of science in its investigation of the world. But people are just beginning to be able to study, to a modest degree, the behavior of complex systems treated in their holistic complexity, not broken down into bits and pieces, but treated as wholes. The subject is very, very preliminary stage. It's really not science at all at the moment, it's natural history. People study examples. They study, quite a lot of the work is done in computer modeling of one sort or another. Some of it is done with physical systems, dissipated physical systems, exchanging energy and entropy with their environment. And when they study these systems, they find that very remarkable things happen to the total system that you would never, ever have foreseen in terms of thinking about the constituent bits and pieces. I say it's a natural history stage because people study these models and they say, gee, it's happened again. And what happens is that these systems display an amazing and unexplained, really, power of spontaneously generating large degrees of large-scale order. They generate, if you like, patterns, remarkable long-range patterns of behavior. And at the moment, nobody knows why they do that. I mean, people just say, gee, it's happened again, and so on. Obviously, there are big discoveries waiting to be made. Just to make the point, let me describe for you briefly a computerized system that's been studied particularly by Stuart Kauffman. Kauffman's the chap who has done a lot of work in this sort of area, one of the pioneers of this thing. He wrote a little book which is available as a Penguin paperback called At Home in the Universe, and explains a lot of these things. And it's a worthwhile read if you're interested in this sort of thing. And here's a system that he describes actually in chapter 4 of the book. It's a logical model because he's going to implement it on a computer. And in logical terms, it's a Boolean net of connectivity too, but it's Sunday afternoon, we don't want to use that sort of language particularly. So we'll think of it in sort of equivalent hardware terms. So consider a vast array, a large array of electric light bulbs. Now each of these bulbs can be in one of two states. It's either on or it's off. And the system is going to develop in steps. And each bulb in the array is correlated with two other bulbs somewhere else in the array. And what they are doing now will determine, according to some simple rules that I don't want to go into, but they really are simple. What they're doing now will determine what this bulb is going to do at the next step of the unfolding history of this array. So you set the system up, and you start it off in a sort of random configuration. Some of the bulbs are on, some of the bulbs are off, and then you allow it to develop according to these rules. And I don't know what you would think, but I think pretty well everybody who thought at all about it would think that nothing very interesting would happen. It would just sort of twinkle away haphazardly for as long as you allowed it to do so. But that isn't true. Very soon, the system settles down to cycling through a very limited number of patterns of illumination. It repeats itself, these cycles, in a sort of way. It organizes itself, its future behavior, spontaneously, in that sort of fashion. And it really is an enormous degree of organization. If there are 10,000 light bulbs in the array, the number of different states of illumination that the array could be in is, of course, 2 to the 10,000, which, give or take a bit, is 10 to the 3,000. But it is found that a system like that will cycle through only about 100 different patterns of illumination. So 10 to the 3,000 somehow got focused out onto 10 to the 2. Which is a fantastic. I mean, every time I tell this story, I'm bowled over just at the thought of it. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. If there are n bulbs in the array, it's something like n to the half patterns of illumination that are generated in that sort of way. Now, that's the spontaneous generation of extraordinary amount of order. Can I say, the big discovery is waiting to be made in this area of science, it seems to be. There must be a deep theory behind all of this. And nobody knows what it is at the moment. If I were a young person going into science, and if I felt very self-confident about myself, I would be tempted to go in that direction. So you see, that generation of holistic, totally unexpected, and highly striking and significant patterns of holistic behaviour in these. And remember, these complex systems are not all that complex. I mean, they're nothing like as complex as a single living cell. I mean, just can't handle anything that's too difficult. Nevertheless, that does encourage the thought that we need this complementary view of the causal structure of the world. Certainly energy between bits and pieces, no doubt about it, but complemented by holistic causal principles of a kind that are concerned not with energy input, but with the organization of the flow of energy, if you like, the input of information that constructs a particular pattern of future behavior. And I think that's how we act in the world, in some highly generalized sense, of course. I mean, as I say, it's hand-waving, but the dualities of constituent holistic, of energy and information, are at least a faint glimmer, faintly suggestive of the much more profound and mysterious dualities of mind and matter, of body and brain. Brain and thought. So that's what I think we should think. And as I say, if you take that, by something like that picture, it seems to me that the openness of the physical process accommodates not only human experiences of agency, but also the notion that there will be a divine interaction. Notice that this is a picture of God's providential action in the world, which is not a sort of poking the finger into the works of the clock to make it work a bit better when it's running a bit slow. This is a possibility of a continuously unfolding interaction of God with the unfolding history of God's creation. And I think that's the most persuasive, theologically persuasive way of explaining that God would act. The God who is the creator of the world acts through the processes of nature, but is not condemned solely to act through the unfolding of natural process. And that seems to me to be persuasive. And if all that's right, there are a number of conclusions that follow from that. First of all, of course, is simply that the scientists can pray. And if God can act in the world, then it is conceivable that we should pray and ask God to do particular things in particular circumstances. But if something like that picture is not terribly misleading, there are some other conclusions that we should draw from that. One is that, though of course there are, been arguing, clouds in the world, there are these exquisitely sensitive systems whose future is in some sense open, there are also lots of clocks in the world. There are regular systems. There are predictable systems of which we have knowledge. In fact, modern science could not have developed without the existence of these predictable systems whose properties could be explored and understood in that sort of way. And that means that and I think that God will maintain the reliability of these clocks, just as God will exploit the cloudiness of clouds. And that means that though God acts in the world, there are limits on what it is sensible, theologically sensible, to ask God to do. It was a point actually made long ago by that great Christian thinker Origen, who said it is not sensible to pray for the cool of spring in the heat of summer. He lived in Alexandria, where it must have been a considerable temptation to pray in that sort of way. But he recognised that the succession of the seasons is a regular, reliable part of the world. And in fact, of course, religious thought has frequently appealed to seed time and harvest, sunrise and sunset, their regularities as signs of the Creator's faithfulness. So there are some things that are not sensible to pray for. Jewish rabbis say, I think about that, one of the things they say about that is this: it is not sensible, they say, to pray that facts are not facts. They say, the rabbis say, if you're sitting in the synagogue and you hear the fire engine going by, you should not pray that the fire is not at your house. Partly because if you did, you were wishing ill fortune on somebody else, but also because you should not pray the facts are not facts. It's a very stern and difficult advice to follow, particularly in the consultant's waiting room. Nevertheless, I think we have to recognise that the world is not infinitely flexible, and God has not willed it to be infinitely flexible in that sort of way. There are some things that are not sensible to pray for, I think. Secondly, the second point is that if the picture I'm trying to peddle is right, and that it is a sort of cloudiness and unpredictability and patchiness physical process that gives the room for manoeuvre, that enables us to have all these experiences, then the process of the world will not be clearly available to be itemized and disentangled. It will not be possible to say nature did this, human will did that, divine providence was the third thing. They'll all be somehow entangled with each other in the cloudiness of unpredictable process. And that means that God's providential action in the world can be absolutely real and can be recognized by the eye of faith, but it will not be demonstrable. Because you can't itemize what is going on in the world in that unambiguous way. You might be sitting at the edge of a marsh, and a band of fleeing slaves comes along, hotly pursued by a band of soldiers. As the slaves approach the marsh, a wind blows up, the water is driven out of the marsh, the slaves get across, essentially dry shore. As their pursuers enter the marsh, the wind drops, the waters return, and the pursuers are engulfed and stuck in the mud. You cannot be forced to say more than that was a pretty lucky accident. But equally, if you are an Israelite fleeing from slavery in Egypt across the Red Sea, you are not forbidden to say that's God's great act of deliverance from slavery in Egypt. Scientific observation, rational argument, so cannot decide between those two things. It requires a different form of insight and interpretation, so that there is a certain cloudiness and ambiguity about the process of the world. Okay, if you buy something of what I've been saying, then you will answer my initial question, can a scientist pray? By saying yes, I'm not absolutely anything, but certainly scientists can pray, take their science absolutely seriously, as they should do, and also take their religious insight and obligation to pray. But then one might ask the question, why do we have to pray at all? I mean, after all, God knows what's going on. And God can judge much more accurately than we can what is good for us. So why doesn't God just go on and do it? I mean, why do we have to ask God for things? Why do we may be able to pray, but why do we have to pray? Why is that something that religious people, I think, feel that they need to do? Well, I think that there are two answers to that question that make a bit of sense to me. One is this. I've been trying to describe a picture of the process of the world in which the future is open, we have a little room for manoeuvre in playing our part in bringing about the future, and I believe that God also interacts providentially with history and plays a major role in bringing about the future. Now what we're doing when we pray, I think, one of the things we're doing when we pray is that we are offering, if you like, our room for manoeuvre to be taken by God and used in positive collaboration with the divine providential will. And I believe that it is the case that when human and divine wills are aligned in that sort of way, things become possible that would not be possible if human and divine wills were at cross purposes with each other. If that picture has some truth in it, it has a number of consequences. One is that prayer and action are opposite sides of the same coin. Our act of praying is our act also of commitment to collaborate with God's will in the world. I like to use sometimes the scientific metaphor of laser light. You know, what makes laser light so remarkable and powerful in its properties? It is, of course, because it is, as the physicists say, coherent. All the waves in the light are in step with each other. All the crests come together and add up. All the troughs come together and add down. You get the maximum effect. If light is incoherent, waves and troughs can coincide and cancel each other out. What we are seeking in prayer, I think, partly, is laser-like coherence between human will and God's will in bringing about the future. It's a very conventional thought. I mean, aligning our will with God's will is a thought that I suppose all religious traditions have about prayer. But that's somehow that's underlined me in thinking thinking about that. So, as I say, prayer is not a substitute for action. If I have an elderly neighbour who is really rather tiresomely reiterative in telling the same old stories about the good old days and that sort of thing, in a way that, you know, after a few times round, it gets a bit wearisome, I do not discharge my Christian obligation to that person simply by staying at home and praying for them. I have to be prepared, by genuinely praying, I have to be prepared to go around occasionally and hear those same old stories over again. It's something you have to do. It also explains something that I think many of us feel instinctively, and that is that it's a good idea to have a lot of people praying for the same thing. And why is that? Because there are more fists beating on the heavenly doors to attract the divine attention? Not at all. There are more wills open to be aligned with the divine will to bring about the desired good in the future of the world. So it reinforces that. But I think there's also a second thing that we're doing when we pray, and I learned this actually from John Lucas, who's an Oxford philosopher. So this is a very generous admission from a Cambridge scientist who learned something from an Oxford philosopher. John Lucas says in one of his books that what we are doing, one of the things we're doing when we pray, is that we are called upon to commit ourselves to what it is we really want. Tell God truly our heart's desire. Not just casually filling in a blank check from some Heavenly Father Christmas, but saying, this, Lord, is what I long for and really wish to see. And I find that a very helpful thought and also a very challenging thought. I mean, it makes prayer very serious. You should be careful what you ask for. You shouldn't ask for trivial things. You should ask for things that are serious and worthwhile. And I think that's right. You know, in the Gospel, Jesus is leaving Jericho. There's a blind man in the crowd, and he shouts out, Lord, help me. And the crowd say, shut up. But Jesus says, come on, come up. And the blind man stands before Jesus, and Jesus says to him, what do you want? I mean, it's always what he wants. He's a blind man, for heaven's sakes. He wants his sight. But he has to say to Jesus, Lord, that I may receive my sight, before he's actually healed. We have to commit ourselves to what it is that we long for when we pray. I find that, as I say, both helpful and challenging. So there we are. Can a scientist pray? Yes, I think a scientist can, with integrity. And not only, of course, can a scientist pray, but many scientists do. But now we perhaps might have a bit of a talk about these things.
Thank you very much, John, indeed. So, well, we've got some good time for discussion and thoughts and questions. Rodney, so, yes.
John, thank you. I wonder, is there a slight tension between what you say in terms of the evolutionary process of the world's coming to be and the kinds of expression about the world being allowed to make itself and creatures being allowed to make themselves? I think it relates to a question we had yesterday, actually. And this idea of God continuously interacting with the world in a way you describe through input of information and so on.
Well, I think there are certainly puzzles about that. The picture I want is that I think I probably said this yesterday, but I'll say it again today, is the picture that Arthur Peacock wrote, so often read about, of the history of creation being the unfolding of a great feud, in which all the players make their contributions. And God is at work, if you like, as the master musician, who is working to bring harmony out of discord and resolution, a final resolution to the feud. And so that the history of the world is a collaborative effort in which, first of all, the regularities of nature, which are themselves expressions of the divine will, and are as much God's action in the world as anything else, they are certainly part of the story. When there are human beings, or moral beings of some sort, with independent wills, their chosen actions are part of the process of the world. But the world is not simply left with those two things at work, but God also is interacting with history, trying to draw it in the right directions. And it is a combination of it. I say you can't disentangle things. It seems to me that all the time we tend to break things down into bits and pieces because obviously it's much easier to think about things. But there are some things whose intrinsic nature is that you can't think of it that way. And so that there is this I mean, I think causality is a zero-sum game. I don't think that there's a tradition in Christian thinking of talking about primary causality and secondary causality. Secondary causality is the causality of creatures, and people like Aquinas believe that nevertheless God is working through all those things. I can't make sense of that quite apart from anything else, and I believe that creatures really do have independence to be themselves and make themselves, and that nature really has an integrity in its given created order, but I think also that it is not left to its own devices, that God interacts with it. Now, obviously there are lots and lots of puzzles about how that works out. The balance between what God does and what creatures do is in Christian theology, it's cosmically large version of the classical problem of grace and free will. And in our own lives, I think we experience both, that we feel, of course, that we are responsible for our lives and we make our decisions. We also very often, particularly retrospectively, when we look back in life, we see that God has been at work in our lives. You know, Paul wrote to the Philippians, he said, work out your own salvation, for it is God who is at work within you. And that's the paradox of the religious life. And I think that's the paradox of the history of creation. And there are lots of puzzles and so on. But all I'm trying to do is to sketch a framework that I think is consistent with what we really know from science, being careful about what we have. I mean, I really do think that it is common to assert, various atheist writers, particularly more polemical kind, to assert that science has established a causal closure of the world. But I think that is just wrong.
A small linguistic point. Could you explain zero-sum game for some here who may not know that expression in English?
No. Well, I mean by that if I do it, I've soaked up a bit of causality, and that isn't left free for you to soak up. You have your own bit in my picture of things, but it requires more philosophical skill than I possess to define it properly. Because of course, there's sort of multiple causality in the world. Obviously, all sorts of things happen, but I think I'm a great believer in the principle of sufficient reason. I think there is something that brings about the future. And I think that all the bits that make up that something, which I'm suggesting again are natural process, human agency, divine providence, add up to produce the future. and there's no sort of redundancy, and there's no sort of chance of true causal principles acting twice. Not very good.
Question in the back, thank you.
Yeah.
There's a prayer that's sometimes quoted, and I think it's by one of the Negroes, which includes a phrase to the effect of, will God enable us to change the things that can be changed and to accept the things that can't be changed,
Right.
and the wisdom to tell the difference. And
Yeah.
I wondered if you had any thoughts on that particular.
Well, I think that
Description.
relates to what I was saying about there are some things that are sensible to pray for and some things that are not. And I'm going back and saying another word about that. I said that the most testing time one of the most testing times for obeying that precept is in the consultant's waiting room, the diagnosis. And I think it is perfectly proper for us to pray, Lord, grant I don't have cancer. That's expressly what we long for. We want to have some more life and be free from pain and so on. But I think we have to recognise that that's our desire. But our desire, because of our desire may not be compatible with what is actually the case. People, of course, know that, obviously.
Yes.
I mean, in all these matters of prayer, there is extraordinary problem of individual, the mystery of individual human destiny. I mean, I had a friend who was a deeply Christian man, had a wife who was a deeply Christian woman. And he was suddenly, out of the blue, diagnosed as having inoperable cancer. And he was told by his consultant, you have 6 months to live. They had wise Christian friends, and my friend's wife was advised to pray with her husband every day and to lay her hands on him, seeking God's healing for him. And she did this regularly, and of course loads of us who knew them were praying for them and so on. Now my friend died pretty well exactly 6 months to the day, the time he'd received the diagnosis. And his wife asked herself after that what had been going on and what had been the result of our prayers. And she came to the conclusion, which she generously showed, 2 things had happened. One was that he was a chap who had quite a lot of controversy in his life and had a difficult relationship with the community in which he operated. But everybody in that community was very struck by the courage and faith with which he faced his impending destiny. And that produced a good deal of healing of relationships in the community. The other thing was he had a condition that might have been expected medically to lead to a fairly distressful death. And in fact, he died peacefully at home with his wife at the bedside. And she concluded that the healing that they had been praying for had been received in this way. Now, obviously, she must have been hoping that it would be received in a different way, in remission. Sometimes healing comes in the acceptance of what's happening. Sometimes it comes in at least temporary redemption of what's happening. And there's a mystery about why is one and why is another. That is just a mystery.
I think there's a question here, and then we'll go to the case here.
When I was a teenager, I was much impressed by a friar giving a talk and producing the mnemonic acts
Oh, yes.
for prayer.
Adoration, contrition, thanksgiving,
Yes, and supplication.
supplication.
And I found that adoration was quite possible. Confession was difficult. That thanksgiving came very naturally. And more I thought, I cannot take this business of supplication. It just does not make sense. You know, how am I? Oh, it's. And many years later, when my wife was dying of cancer, I couldn't stop myself. And I would still say, I don't suppose it made any difference. It happened. But the difference it made to me subsequently was that I have found it easier to add supplication in the sense of at least holding people or events up before God, not telling him what I thought ought to happen, but just being aware of it.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think that's right. When I was a theological student at Westcott, part of this sort of practical training was to
do hospital visiting, and I was allocated a ward in Edinburgh, which had people with acute leukemia, and many of them weren't all that old, and they used to visit these people, and you knew that most of them were going to die, and you sort of ask yourself, what am I doing? I didn't think that, of course, when you left the ward, you had to pray for these people, very much on your mind, a concern. But I didn't think that all, because this nice young middle-aged chap from Westcott had gone around to see that they were all going to recover in some miraculous way. But what I think you were trying to do was to be with them in what was happening to them, and through prayerfulness, perhaps in a small way, help them to come into the presence of God with what was happening to them. And I think that was what one was trying to do, and sometimes I think was able to do, enabled to do. I think I should say. So yes, I think that's right. It is the. You see, it's part of it all. Part of the perplexity and complexity and mystery of it all is accepting the human condition. I mean, I also, when I was a curate in Bristol, I had the experience of being suddenly very seriously ill. In fact, I thought I was going to die. And when you're in that sort of situation, you just long for magic. Any magic, medical magic, white magic, black magic, anything to get you out of it. But nevertheless, you know that magic doesn't happen. And I found it. I had an emergency operation. I was very debilitated, recovering from it. I lay there in my hospital bed, and they had all these drips and things, and somehow you felt you had to keep on concentrating on those drips to help them to do their job. You know, my whole world was reduced to that. And I found it impossible to pray. I mean, God seemed just far, far away. But I was very conscious and sustained by being prayed for. I knew my family were praying for me, I knew my church was praying for me, I knew some nuns who were great friends of mine were praying for me. And somehow or other it did for me then what I couldn't do for myself. We'll never make much sense of prayer unless we believe that there is some sort of interrelationship between human beings. I mean, we live in a very atomized society in which we value and exaggerate our separateness from each other, I think. Of course, that's part of the story, but it's only part of the story.
Looks like it's put in a comment here before we go to the questions to the back. Thinking about Canna-Sinus prayer, I mean, I think as somebody who's actually cancer research is what I do, and I often think I challenge actually churches and other religious communities to pray for scientists who are engaged in cancer research, because there's some great drugs coming along, you know, and people who very sadly have died 10 years ago wouldn't be alive today, you know, because there's some fantastic new therapies coming along. And I just think one thing definitely Christians and people of all faith can pray for is for breakthroughs in cancer, you know, and understanding and getting some of these great drugs coming along. So I just put this sort of practical point in there, I think, which,
yes, absolutely. And I'm sure that God's healing purposes are as often fulfilled through medical science as any other way.
Yes, yeah. Yes, there's two questions, but actually you first.
Well, mine is a very brief one. I was really going to comment on what you've been saying before, and perhaps it relates to what you've just been saying as well. It reminds me of the collect at the end of evening prayer, where we prayed for a lot of things, and then we asked God to grant our petitions as may be most expedient for us.
Yes, yes.
He knows
Yes, I mean,
how to grant them.
Yes,
More than we
yes. I mean, I think this, you know, your will be done is an indispensable part of prayer. So often, of course, I think, to be perfectly honest, we use it as sort of escape clause for God. We don't really expect God to do very much, but we say, okay, well, you understand, I'm asking a bit much. I mean, I find that in myself, and it's not a very edifying thing to find in oneself. But it, nevertheless, at a deeper spiritual level, it's an indispensable part of acknowledging the mystery of life.
Question to that.
Yeah, it's a kind of very simple question, so I apologise, but it's intriguing. On my teaching practice at the moment, it's something that always comes up. Would you distinguish between prayer and miracles? Would you say that they are different, and just your opinion on that?
You always know when somebody says they're going to ask a simple question, they're going to I've been trying to present a picture, I believe, God's interaction with the world, which theologians might call general providence, God's interaction with the unfolding history of the world. And I want to argue that God does particular things on particular occasions, because that's why we use personal language about God. But I do believe also that in exceptional occasions, God may do exceptional things. And as I think did I talk about miracle yesterday? The problem of miracle is a degree of divine consistency. God is not a show-off conjurer, but there may be particular circumstances in which it is appropriate, that's not a word for a preacher about the Creator, appropriate for God to act in unprecedented, unexpected ways. And for a Christian, of course, the resurrection of Jesus Christ would be the absolute paradigm example of that. And so I would make a distinction between God's general providence acting within unfolding history, God's special acts on particular occasions, which are usually connected, perhaps invariably connected, with some special act of divine self-disclosure that could only be made manifest in that particular and unexpected way. I think it's an important distinction, and thank you for asking that.
Yes, question in front.
You spoke in a sense of the mechanism of prayer, whereby we are opening ourselves to act on God's behalf, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
But you also spoke of God Himself being involved.
Yes.
Are you suggesting thereby that our prayer influences what God is going to do, and that He might otherwise have done something different?
Well, what I'm suggesting is not that sometimes you listen to sessions in church, people are sort of suggesting a rather clever idea to God that God might not have thought of, or are drawing his attention to something he might have misseeing. We're not influencing God in that sense, obviously. But I do think, I think that if we offer ourselves and our wills to align with the divine will, we are, if you like, giving God opportunity to do things that could be blocked by human refusal to cooperate with the divine will. God's will is unchanging, God's purposes are unchanging. But if God has given true freedom to creatures, as I believe God has, then our choices, for good or ill, do act as constraints on what God can actually bring about in the world. Which again makes prayer a very serious business, if you understand. That's the
Question back. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In terms of praying for only the most important things, I agree it's most important to pray for the most important things, and Muslims' most frequent prayer is a prayer for guidance, as that's the most important thing, we have continual guidance. But there's also an Islamic saying of the Prophet that pray for everything, no matter how small, even if it's the strap on your sandal breaks, pray for that. And it's there to sort of encourage humility and know that you're dependent on God in everything, and to submit your will to His, as you said, in every single sphere of life. So I'd be interested in your comments, because you mentioned about praying for the most important things and not perhaps for other things. Where prayer is something
I thank you for saying that. I'm sympathetic to that, I have to say. I mean, I don't think we should think that God is only concerned with grand things. Of course, we should, as far as it's possible for us, open ourselves to the divine will. If there is some great act, I mean, if God wills human actions about climate change, and we should seek to pray about that, our little role in all that. But I think there's a sense in which nothing is, nothing too true. As you said that very carefully, you're ahead of a number of these sort of things. I mean, we don't want to trivialize prayer. I mean, I'm uneasy when pious people sometimes say, when I'm in town on the Lord's business, there is always a convenient parking space exactly where I need to stop. that does seem to me, a little bit trivializing prayer. I mean, God takes all that trouble to wire that chap with parking spaces, saving you having to walk 20 yards down the street. Why doesn't God take a bit more attention to his neighbour who's dying of pancreatic cancer? I mean, you have to sort of strike the balance. But I think too high flow is spiritually dangerous in a sense. It's exaggerated.
Yes, question.
I'm just wondering if we could extrapolate what you said about prayer to sort of understanding what we mean by spirit, the Holy Spirit. If prayer is aligning our will with God's will, could we sort of think of spirit in that way? Holy Spirit aligning what God wants and what we want.
Yes, I think that this notion of information, which is badly ill-defined and vague and exploratory at the moment, holds a lot of promise for thinking about things. I mean, let me take over an entirely different tack and say, you know, I think humans are psychosomatic unities. Does that mean I've lost the notion of the soul? Well, I certainly don't think of it in detachable, spiritual, Platonic or Cartesian terms. But that might, then you say, okay, you also believe in a destiny beyond death, and surely the soul has been the connector between life in this world, life in the world to come. Have you lost that? Well, I don't think I've lost it, but I certainly will have to reconceptualize it. And I think that for example, the soul, it's almost as difficult to think what the soul might be in this life as it might be beyond this life. Because the soul, in some sense, is the real me, presumably, if we're using the name. And what's the real me? I mean, here am I, aged, balding academic. What makes me the same person as the schoolboy with the shock of black hair in the photograph of whatever it is years ago? Well, of course, it's tempting at first sight to say material continuity, but of course we know that's an illusion. I am atomically distinct from that schoolboy. My atoms are being changed all the time through eating and drinking, wear and tear. So what makes me the same as that schoolboy is not crass material continuity, but it's something like, it's not the atoms of my body are the same as the atoms of his body, but in some sense the pattern in which they're organized, the information-bearing, almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern in which they're organized, is related to the pattern of that schoolboy. Of course, it's different. I have more memories. My character, I hope, has developed a bit over the years. But that's the carrier of continuity between me and the schoolboy and me, and I believe between me and my life in the world to come. So I think of the soul as being the almost infinitely complex information-bearing pattern of the body, in that sense, which is quite close to the Aristotelian Thomistic notion of the soul as the form of the body. That's what Aquinas thought the soul was. I mean, there's some differences, but it's connected with that. So I think there's a lot of promising stuff here. I mean, the difficulty is, of course, I say that even scientifically, even in relation to moderately complex systems, these ideas are not properly understood, not properly formulated, and so on. And when we start thinking about living cells, they're much more complicated. We think cells are much more complicated again. So there's lots of hand waving in sort of area. But I do think there are promising and sensible directions in which to wave one's hand.
I think there's an aspect about the Holy Spirit in your question as well,
Oh, yes.
isn't there?
Yes.
So, yes.
Yes. Well, I've tried to give a picture of God interacting with the world through the input of information. I mean, we're embodied things, so we're both matter and information. But I think God is not material, and so I think God interacts with the world through the shaping input of information. And within, in some sense, hidden within the cloudy processes of the world. That's not unlike the notion that one has in Christian theology, for example, of the Holy Spirit hiddenly at work on the inside of creation, groaning and travailing with creation in its unfolding history. So I think that there's again some sort of kinship there. But of course, I mean, God is spirit in a way in which no creature is spirit. I mean, I'm very resistant to myself to assimilating creatures to the Creator. I think it's very important to maintain the distinction between the divine nature and any form of created nature, including human nature. But I think there are, again, resources in that sort of area. It's very, I mean, it's interesting in Christian theology, isn't it, that I mean, Christians do find it extraordinarily difficult to think about the Holy Spirit. If you think about traditional artistic representations of the Trinity, you get the kingly figure of the Father, you get the crucified figure, usually of the Son, and then you have this tiny little bird hovering between the two. Sometimes you don't even have that in the St. Callistus Chapel in Wells Cathedral. The bird is absent. And you don't really quite know how to think about the Holy Spirit. I was at, all my science days, I was a fellow of Trinity, and we, at one stage or other, we commissioned a modern artist to produce a picture to go in the great baldacchino at the east end of the chapel. Kerry Richards was the artist, and he produced a sketch for this, which was a sketch of Pentecost, and there were the apostles down below, who were Donish figures, hovering above them was a curious sort of highly coloured amoeba, which represented the Holy Spirit. He didn't think it was very good, and we didn't go ahead with it. So it is difficult to think about it. And I think we do have to think about the Spirit in somewhat abstracted terms, but I think there are little imaginative resources available to us, little imaginative resource available to us in that sort of way.
Yes, question. So you were talking about God acting in the sort of cloudy part of nature.
Yeah.
Does that mean in this subatomic sort of world, is it God sort of, and then it sort of tends to be a little bit like a sort of God in the gaps? And I think sort of related to that question, might be a separate question altogether, because you mentioned Arthur Peacock a couple of times already. Does that sort of move to a sort of a panentheistic view of the universe? It's probably Arthur Peacock would have subscribed to.
Well, there's a lot of good questions there. Let me see. Just remind me where you began.
Does God say act in a subatomic world?
Yeah.
For
Well,
predictability?
I'm suggesting that God acts through the openness of physical process, and of course part of the openness of physical process is reflected at the appropriate level by the widely believed openness of quantum theory. And there have been people in the 1990s. The science and religion community spent most of its time arguing about divine action, and there was a lot of people who thought that quantum theory was the answer. I don't doubt that it's part of the answer, but I very much doubt that it's the whole answer. I don't think that God actually was simply like scrabbling around with these subatomic roots of the world. God's providential action must be effective and discernible, as far as it is discernible in the eye of faith, at the macroscopic, everyday level of things. That's why I'm myself keen to maintain a role for chaos theory. Now, I think the causal structure of the world, I say our acquaintance with it scientifically is patchy, but I think that the causal structure of the world is an integrated whole that we don't know how to describe. And the quantum openness is part of it, chaotic openness is part of it. And it's a complicated story. And I don't think I act in the world simply by influencing quantum processes in my body, or simply by some sort of chaotic thing. I think it's a complex thing which I don't know how to describe, and even more so for God. So it's a broad openness of the process. Now, is that the God of the gaps? Well, this is a serious question. The answer to that is yes and no. What's wrong with the God of the gaps? It's almost the ultimate term of abuse in the science religion area to accuse somebody of going for the God of the gaps. Well, the gaps that are bad gaps are epistemological gaps. They're gaps of knowledge. Only God could create life. That sort of thing. We don't, as we've been told, don't understand the processes by which life came about, but we have every reason, I think, to believe and hope that one day we will. Those are the sort of gaps that are bad gaps to put your money on, because the God of those sort of gaps is a sort of Cheshire cat deity, always over the next intellectual horizon, always vanishing with the advance of knowledge. And that can't be. God is the creator of the world. But if there is a genuine openness in terms of the bottom-up picture, conceptual picture of the causal structure of the world, as I've been arguing today there is, then we are people of the gaps in our exercise of agency. And God is, I believe, the providential God of the gaps, but that's a non-pejorative form of gap. Because if it's right, it's an intrinsic form of gapping. That's why I underlined intrinsic when I was talking about unpredictability. So, of course, it's speculative, and it's no doubt certainly inadequate. Now, is it panentheism? Well, I've always been against panentheism myself. That's one of the issues on which Arthur and I didn't agree. I want to maintain the distinction between creator and creation. And I certainly I don't think that God is simply a detached and distant figure. I want to believe in the immanence of the divine as well as the transcendence of the divine. But I don't want to risk any identification of creator with creation. And I think that panentheism, it's either undefined. I mean, panentheism is if you read panentheist writing, people say that panentheism means that the world is part of God in some sense, they usually say. But they are unable to say in what sense that's so. And I think I'm not persuaded by that. but I think God is present in the world, close to the breathing and all that sort of thing. I don't think we need to go down the pantheist route. There's no doubt that classical Christian theism, say of the Thomistic time, the later Middle Ages, did overstress the transcendence of God. God acts on creatures, but creatures don't act on God, and so on and so on. But I don't think we need. I think we can restore the balance by simply renewed emphasis on divine evidence, without having to go overboard on pantheism. That's my own view.
Yes.
Well, it's just following up on that, because Arthur used that model to talk about whole-part influence and top-down causation. I mean, is there anything to be salvaged from that, as it were, even analogically, or does it go if we? I don't want to follow pantheism either, so does that?
Well, I have to say, I'm a bit of a rebel over the nice. I felt dissatisfied with a great deal of discussion in our community. People like Arthur, great chap in all sorts of ways, would appeal to this notion of top-down causality. And again, our experiences of agency feel like that. It's I, the whole person, who does that sort of thing. But I think that the influence of the whole upon the parts is not an unproblematic concept. And you have to discuss the causal structure of the world. I go back to what I said earlier, that I believe causality is a zero-sum game. If the constituent interactions totally soaked up all the causal room for manoeuvre, there would be no true action of the whole upon the parts. And so you do need a causal analysis. It may be it will of course be speculative, and so on. And people were continually berating me for attempting that. Some bitterness comes into my dialogue at this stage. But I think you have to do it, however attentively, and so on. You see, that's very interesting. I go back to that Kaufman example. That's a very interesting example, because Kaufman's thing demonstrates the holistic appearance of these amazing properties. Nevertheless, remember, it's a computer model. It's a totally deterministic model in which the interactions between the different bits of the array totally determine what happens. There is no though there are holistic effects, there is no true top-down influence of the whole upon the parts in the Kaufman model. Now, in physical models, dissipated systems far from greater than generate patterns of order, that need not be so because of what we talked about, intrinsic unpredictabilities. But you have to be very careful in your causal analysis. You can't just read it off. You can't just read off top-down things off just the appearance of things. And I think there was far too slick an invocation of whole part top-down interactions on the part of really people who know better.
John, do you think we have there, quite a good analogy from a biology?
Yeah.
In biology, you always have the arrows going both ways. You've got information flowing from DNA and sort of making bodies and all that sort of thing. But then you've got all the body and the proteins and everything is flowing down the other way. So it's always the arrows going in both directions, which is why you can't really be a sort of strict deterministic in biological terms, simply because it's top down and bottom up at the same time. Do you think there's a fair kind of picture there, analogy, maybe?
Well, I'm not sure about that, because I'm inclined to believe that's true, but I think it requires more argument than saying that's true. I mean, somebody presumably like Francis Crick, a molecular reductionist, who tells you that all you are is a collection of molecules, wouldn't quite see it that way. It's a very interesting feature about reductionists, strong reductionist people. They never go the whole way. They always stop at their own discipline. So for a molecular biologist, it's molecules that are the whole story. Great big things like molecules, from a particle physics point of view. For a geneticist, it's genes. Like Dawkins, it's genes that are the things that we know. I think it is complicated. I'm sure that biology exemplifies that, but I think you have to argue for it a bit more. But it's very difficult to be guided, because obviously we have to use pictures of things. We have to grant things a certain independent. The whole question of levels is undoubtedly you need level concepts. Undoubtedly you can't discuss ecological problems in terms of quarks and gluons. You have to have these things. The question that's a different question from the question of what are the causal connections that operate.
Good. How are we doing? Any more questions? Oh, the home stretch. Sorry.
5 minutes on.
We've got 5 minutes. Okay, yes, that's just we've got a bit more film, you know, if you have any more questions burning. What happens if people leave and go down the road and think, oh, you know, if I don't ask that one, you know. So, last chance saloon here before we head for the road. But yes, okay.
Can I just
so,
go back a little
yeah.
to Neva and the wisdom to tell the difference between what can and cannot be changed? I'm just thinking a little of when Tom Houghton was talking to us on Friday night, and he talked about that remarkable man, George Muller, and praying for the orphanages in Bristol and so forth. I'm thinking about Jesus' phrase about faith to move mountains, which seems a very long way from the sort of reputed wriggle room that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle might provide, and things of that kind. And I suppose my misgiving about Neva's prayer is that I've often heard it used in circumstances where I suspect that the things that can't be changed are deemed to loom very large, and the things that can be changed are tiny and accessible, as it were. And I think Muller thought that some of the large things that couldn't be changed could.
Yeah.
And I found that very provocative.
Yeah, well, this is probably we need to be provoked about that sort of thing. I mean, a whole life is like life is. On the one hand, we don't want to simply be complacent and say, well, that's the way, there's nothing to do about it. And undoubtedly, there are extraordinary stories of people
receiving answers to prayers. I mean, George Muller and praying for things, and people who say, you know, really say a story, but it's perhaps I must have been here telling you a story about the Iona community, and they needed to roof the, you would say that, needed to roof their church there, and it was wartime, they didn't have the material, and the next day, they prayed about it, the next day there was a small ship wrecked on the shore which had a cargo of wooden planks. I mean, extraordinary things do happen. You know, William Temple said that, of course there are coincidences in the world, but I find that when I pray there are more coincidences when I don't pray. But it's very important not to see prayer as simply a magic lever. And I say, you know, we're back to this, the mystery of answers to prayer. I mean, the answer might have been to the Iona people, stick it out.
Okay, I think we've really worked John very hard indeed, both yesterday and today, and I think we really want to thank him very much indeed for all this.